Gianfranco, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. I really do appreciate it. Uh, In Viaggio is a beautiful film.
Thank you. Thank you
Uh,
so much.
it really truly is a beautiful portrait of Pope Francis. I'm wondering, why were you so passionate to tell this story in this way?
Well, because I encountered the Pope twice. 10 years ago, when I did it, when I finished Fire 3, Fuoco a Mare, the film I shot in Lampedusa, that was his first trip he did outside the Vatican Wall. And then 10 years later, when I finished Notturno, I was contacted by the Vatican because the Pope was doing a trip in Iraq, where I spent 3 years of my life making the film Notturno, and which was a painful 3 years. And unfortunately, the film came up with a pandemic, so it was a bit of a disaster. Although we also did the Oscar running where we arrived to the short list. But the film didn't have much showing around, which for me it's a pity that that film kind of died in the history of pandemic, basically. But somehow the Pope was going to Iraq, and I was contacted by the Osservatore Romano, where I did an interview before with them. And I was able to watch the footage that they did in Iraq. And the Pope read about this interview, I did it. And then they contacted me to see if I could do some work on the footage that they shot in Iraq. And somehow that footage was extremely impossible for me to relate to, because it was shot for live television. And so I kind of renounced to do any kind of work. But then that moment, I started thinking about how many trips the Pope did. I didn't know that at that point the Pope did 34 trips. And I got really fascinated with the idea of, what was interesting for me was Lampedusa and Baghdad. So two of my films, they were somehow framing this 9 years at the time of the Pope apostolic trips. And then in between, there was another film I did in Mexico, which is called Sicario. So there were three kind of moments, which for me, they were very important, that somehow there were three more very important trips of the Pope. Plus, when I learned that the Pope did so many traveling, I started visioning him around the world, from one place to another place, from head of state to another head of place, from a catastrophe, natural catastrophe to a natural catastrophe, to taking position as a head of state. So I start picturing this idea, and of course, when I say that to the Vatican, they were very enthusiastic about this idea, and they gave me more than 100 hours of footage to watch, which was an extreme challenge there. So for 6 months, we were just watching with my editor footage till somehow I realized that the film was possible. I didn't want the film to be produced by the Vatican, so I got the right scene. I got involved on that, and we start editing in a very at the beginning. The first structure of the film, it was a very impressionistic structure with no chronological, with no borders, with no interview, with no commentary. It was almost a psychogeography. It was like a human geography, and the portrait of a pope, which was somehow also reflecting the world that we are watching. So it was also a portrait of this world we are living, a portrait of this shaking world that we are living. So for me, the idea was always, okay, I want to make this film not ideological, not theological. I wanted to make more than a portrait of a man, of a pope, a portrait of a man. And but with this, for me, was important to show somehow a reflection on this upside down world that we're living. So this for me was the challenge of this film.
I love that you bring that up because that was one of the things that's so apparent in its structure is the dichotomy between the message and reality. The Pope is tasked with bringing these messages of hope, and yet we see what's going on in the world around them. We see and hear the stories of brokenness. I was wondering, for you, one of the things that keeps coming up in the story is the power of the dream.
Yeah.
I was wondering why that was such an important emphasis and how you balance that with the realities that were happening around him.
Well, this was one of the first speech that I heard when I was looking at the footage, which struck me a lot, to have a Pope say, dream, don't lose the capacity of dream of a world that we still don't see, but it's gonna come, it was such a powerful idea. And this was the first thing I extrapolate from these 800 hours and kept it there. It was always the beginning of the film. The film changed so many times, structure and things, but that beginning was always there. And I wanted somehow this to be a red thread, into the movie. Also, he mentioned this many times in his trip, when he's in Cuba, when he's in the Senate, in the U.S. Senate. It is a great moment when he said this country was founded by 4 dreamers, he said. And he's referring to Dorothy Day, Thomas Norton, Martin Luther King, and Lincoln. And then he goes down against the army, against the thing. So the idea of a dream in this upside down world, is, for me, it was like a very secular concept, almost a Jungian concept. And hearing this from a Pope, I think, was a very strong message, because this Pope has the ability of talking to everybody, to believer and not believer, to Christian, to Muslim, to Jewish, to Buddhist, to Hindu. And he's a Pope that is somehow beloved transversally. He's a Pope that is able to be almost like a head of state, and one of the few people in this moment of that we are living, such a difficult moment in history. He's almost a political guidance. He warned us about the fragility of the world we are living, and he constantly warns us about how be united and how to change, and taking a position that can change things. I start the film with the shot of my previous film of Far at Sea, when there is in Lampedusa a boat that is sinking, and the Coast Guard asks to the people that are in danger, and probably they died because there was no trace of that boat anymore, and say, what's your position? What's your position? For me, this is a kind of a metaphor throughout the movie on challenging each of us to ask this question, what's my position? What's my position towards all the aspects that the world, that the Pope is touching, from climates, inmates, dignity, poverty, war, army exchange. So all these issues that are very relevant for me in the movie, and are political issues, most of them. We can change something if we all determine what is our position towards these issues.
Yeah,
But the film somehow is a tribute to whom he tried to change something. And I think this Pope is trying to change something within the church and outside the church, he's facing a lot of battle to change the approach of the church against certain conservatism and certain radical idea that are still hanging inside the wall of the church, And this is a Pope that somehow, I think, is a revolutionary somehow in certain aspect, this Pope. And as all revolutionary people, he's a lonely man also. At the end of the film, there is a sense of loneliness, which is also our loneliness probably in this moment.
Yeah, and at the end of that film, I love because it ends with that shot with him just by himself, and you get a real sense of the burden on his soul, and throughout the film, with each message, you get the sense that there's a real weight on his soul, um, that he wants to see change. He wants to offer hope. He wants to see the world be a different place.
Yeah, because this Pope, he talks, but he also listens a lot. He listens to people. We don't listen to him much. we kind of lose this world and think, okay, the Pope talking again about this. We're not ready to hold these messages because we are too busy with our daily life. And he said that in many moments in the film. Either we're all together or we're all gonna be defeated. And somehow this film is also about us being defeated, you know, as a human being, as a population of this world. And this concept remains, as I say, I'm not Catholic, I'm not a believer, but for me, the idea that there is someone reminding us and warning us constantly about these issues, it's a very important thing. So that's why somehow I wanted to make this film, because there's no head of state right now that is able to address this issue with such a passion and with such a motivation, you know? Mm.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I was wondering too about that message and think, with all the time that you spent watching his speeches and seeing interacting with the with him and the messages. Do you feel like the messages shift based on where he is? Like it felt like I'm not talking about the specificities of the situation because we see things like residential schools, we hear things war. I'm just wondering if in your perspective you feel like the message, the vision of the kingdom shifts.
I think the message changed the moment he flies away from the Vatican, you know, because that's for me what was important about this film, to see this Pope outside the daily life and conflict of the Vatican life, you know, to see him outside the wall of the Vatican. And we always change on trip, you know, we have to give up something when we travel, you know. There is a big change that happens to each of us when we travel. We kind of give up a part of our identity, part of our being, and we open up to a world that is not ourselves. So we have to do a certain mission of humbleness, you know, in order to be able to interact to something that doesn't belong to our daily life. So I believe very strongly that this changed the Pope a lot. But in a way, it doesn't change his message. And this I have somehow a proof of that. Because the first editing I did on the film before the war, it was, as I was telling you before, a very impressionistic film, very open, very almost like a poetic things of messages, of things, of words. You never knew where it was, the state, the borders. There was no borders. There was no chronological order. The film was starting in Iraq and was ending in Lampedusa, the first edit I did. Then when the war started, I went to Malta with him, and in Malta he addressed the subject of the war in a very very heavy way, you know, and he takes a very strong position there. And when I edited that part of the when he's talking about the war in Malta, when he's praying down all that end of the film that is still there, the film didn't make any more sense, you know. Somehow history devoured all my film in one instant, and I didn't know what to do anymore. So this film doesn't make any more sense. What's happening right now is so heavy and so impact that whatever happened the 9 years before doesn't make any more sense, the way the film was edited. Then after a few days, I told my editor, let's try to edit the film in a chronological way. Let's see what happened. And once we start editing the film in a chronological way, from Lampedusa, arriving to Baghdad, and then to Malta, and to this war, suddenly everything became its own weight and became like a prophetic parable almost, you know, like una parabola, like, and everything started making sense. Um, the sorry, I took a note. The film somehow had his own weight and his own structure, and I realized the power of this Pope when he talks. You know, almost every single trip he does, it becomes like a station of the God. You know, like a Via Crucis, where there is a meditation, where there is a moment of silence, where there is a moment of recharge, and every trip becomes like a sort of secular and political and terrenal worthy uh, station of the cross, you know, for me. And and at the end, you know, from his first speech to his last speech, there is it makes sense, you know, all that. It's like an itinerary. It's like a una parabola, like a parable, you know. So it does change, as I was saying, he changed the moment he goes outside the Vatican political labyrinth. And the moment he's out, and that's what fascinates me, to make a Pope always outside the Vatican. We see him only twice, and maybe the climax of the film is in the emptiness, in the void of St. Peter's Square, when he addressed the world about the pandemic. You know, for the first time, the Western world is facing a moment of suspension of our future, and there the Pope is with an incredible strong speech, is able somehow to talk to the whole world, you know, as I say, believers and not believers. He say, we are all here now in this moment of uncertainty, and why we are here. So he forced us to think. So for me, that's a bit the climax in this emptiness of the Vatican under the rain, with the sound of the siren, of the ambulance outside, and this enemy, which at the time we didn't know with whom we were dealing with. You know, so the first time again, our society, our privileged society, it was defeated, you know, in a sense. And for the first time, we experienced the idea of being in a future that we don't know where it's taking us, and we're still paying the consequence of that. You know, change that so much, each of us, in that unfortunately negative way, but not in a positive way. But it was a huge change, and somehow the word of the Pope, the words of the Pope are very strong. You know, and I remember listening to this and say, well, this is the only person who's able to talk to the world like that. You know, with such a strength, with such a determination, which just also at the end giving maybe some hope to us. You know, in this moment of darkness. And then there is another moment where he's in the Vatican, and it's when he encountered the space shuttle, the Soyuz space, and that somehow is also a metaphor for me of what I was saying before about this prophetic element that he has. You know, when he said, "Good morning, you all," his word, they don't arrive there immediately. It takes some time for us to capture his word, and this is a bit of a metaphor that when he talked, we're always able to grasp his message, you know. And somehow that shot of the Soyuz, I love it because the perspective of the astronaut from the top, this world is so beautiful, so fragile. There's no border. There's the commander of the U.S. Mission. He said, "There's no borders here. There's no." We all know the fragility of this earth that we have to preserve. There's no war. There's no conflict from here. But looks at how fragile is our planet, you know, and how important is the work that each individual can do in order to change certain things. And again, what's your position, you know, on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's some striking imagery there, and that scene where you're talking about, where he's in, where is that in the? I thought it was at the Vatican, where he's sitting by himself during the
Yeah,
pandemic.
when the Pope is talking to them, he's in the Vatican, when he's in the desk, and he addresses to them that are like who knows where.
Yes, of course. But
Yeah.
it's such a stark
But these
image.
are the only two moments in the Vatican during the pandemic, and when he talks, when he cannot travel. Sometimes you see the urge of this Pope to go somewhere, and where he goes to the old world, you know. He goes to above the earth, you know. So the film starts with this world that is upside down, and slowly we see the world, and we perceive this world, and at the end, when we arrive to the war, we see it from the top, and we see the thin line of the sun, and we see the earth, and then we hear the sound of the war, you know, from there, and that's our defeat again, you know. So the film start with hope, dream, and then the events, they kind of have their own cascade, you know, and they devour us on a daily thing. So at the end of the film, there is a sense of loneliness on the Pope and a sense of defeat when he say, "Non sia fatta la nostra volontà," don't do our will, which is very strong. You know, usually it's like, do our will, what we desire, but say, please don't allow us to perform our will, because our will is a catastrophe. Non sia fatta la nostra volontà.
the pattern of Cain and the pattern of peace. He talks, at the end, he's talking about, how we are not used to thinking in a pattern of peace, and see the damage that we've done.
Hmm.
Um, I know we're running out of time, but I'm just wondering, from your experience making this film, what does this experience teach you about Pope Francis and his legacy? Is there something that jumps out at you and says there's something unique about him?
Well, yeah, I try to evoke this uniqueness is his sense of being able to talk to everybody and he able to spread a message that is very strong in a transversal way. And what struck me really very strongly, this is a pope that doesn't do proselytism, you know. So when he talks, he's never talks as someone that would try to change you. We always say, "Who am I to judge?" You know. So even the big issue that the church was always denying, this pope somehow he's tried to make some little change, you know, towards gay union, towards towards abortion, of course. No, but for example, he never condemned the abortion and say, "Oh, you go to hell, you know, you're gonna die." The only once he addressed the issue of abortion, and he say, I embrace and hold the women that are have to go through this painful decision, and they have my own compassion and my own. I'm there with them in this difficult choice that they're making. So he never really put a position which is radical, condemning, and go crazy about it. Or, you know, his position with the pedophilia, people say, well, he's not doing enough, but he's trying to do a lot on that. You know, before that was a taboo, the church never talked. There's a moment in the film when he addressed this to the bishop in in the States, and it's a very, very strong speech he does against pedophilia. And no other pope ever did that, you know, towards the union of gay, he always his position. So when there is love, it's good that love is there. And who am I to judge that? I just embrace the love. And then people say, yeah, but he doesn't give benediction to that. And that maybe will come, you know, so hopefully, you know, but as I say, I'm not a Catholic, I know things, and I try to see the good and the bad on that. But for me, what is important about this Pope is that there is a light there. There is something that he's trying to illuminate us by warning us on say, well, we are living in a very shaky world, and he's somehow how, he's a player of this globalized world, you know, the Pope, you know, and that's what I feel strongly about that, you know. And he's a Pope that's able to ask forgiveness for his own and the name of the church. And this we see in the film when he say, "I did a mistake. I was asking for proof. These people have been so much hell already, and the Pope asking for proof. This was a big mistake I did." So there's a humility on that, you know, asking forgiveness also for his own mistake.
Absolutely, absolutely. It honestly, it is a beautiful film, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for taking the
Thank
time
you
to
so
talk.
much. Let's hope that people go to see the film.
I hope so too.
Thank
Okay.
you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks a
Have a
lot.
great day.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.